This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome into another episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, and I'm joined once again by Rob Riches and Dan Heaning. And with another draft in the books a few weeks ago, the Flyers prospects were on full display at the team's annual development camp, which wrapped up on Wednesday. So we'll be spending the next hour looking at a few prospects that stood out during camp. We're going to split this into segments by position. So we'll start with the forwards. And guys, this was obviously marred by the news that Nolan Patrick, the second overall pick in this year's draft, was not going to be on the ice after undergoing surgery to repair a sports hernia on June 13th. But there were still plenty of players to watch. So who were the forwards that stood out to you guys?
I was a big fan of Nicolas Aube-Kubel. I've been pretty high on him for a few years now, so I always like to try to keep an extra eye on him when I get down to rookie camp just to see how he's developing. And I was also, I thought that David Kasha had stood out to me as well. I really liked what he had to offer. And the last guy I think that was really sticking out for me was Rupstov. Herman Rupstov, I just saw he was... I think it was towards the end of the Sunday session where he was just basically setting up and just really kind of showcasing the shot that he has. And, I mean, he's really letting it go. He's got a cannon for a slapper. And I thought to see him let go of that, all he's got to work on is just, getting it more on net. He's got some speed to it. He's got some power to it, and I'd like to see how that develops.
To your point of Yarmin Rupstov, I was watching him during the 3-on-3 tournament, and towards the end, because it was Team White versus Team Black, and they went to a 2-on-2, 2 overtimes, so 2-on-2, double overtime. And if you were watching that, for most of that first overtime, I believe, it was just Phil Myers versus Yarmin Rupstov. They just went toe-to-toe, wouldn't give each other an inch, and that was a really intriguing matchup. But you could just watch Yarmin Rupstov's skating. It was just, he was making all sorts of cuts. He was moving. He was setting things up. He was creating so much havoc and opportunities offensively. So he was a nice player to keep an eye on. A couple of players that I was looking out for during the 3-on-3s. Morgan Frost caught my eye. That kid just is sneaky good defensively. There was one play during the 3-on-3 where he snuck inside of Isaac Ratcliffe just to steal the puck, and Ratcliffe just looked like he had just had his pocket picked. It was, and Morgan Frost had done that multiple times throughout the day. So that was, it kind of caught me off guard. I knew how good he was skating wise and how much he could set up offensively, but just to see how confident he was in his small frame and using it defensively, that impressed me a lot. And then speaking of Ratcliffe's size, I didn't know how much that kid knew he was big because he was using his reach defensively. That was just, it was great. He was using it to stop plays. He was using his reach to create opportunities in close. And his skating, one of the things that we were told was like, oh, he's 6'6", he needs to work on his skating, right, guys?
Oh, yeah, sure.
He looked great skating. I don't know what you guys, how he looked the times that you were there, but his skating was really, it was a lot better than what I had been advertised upon.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of still called it average at times. I mean, in some of the drills I saw, it wasn't perfect, but it's certainly not as bad as it was made out to be. I certainly liked a lot about Ratcliffe. I mean, you get up close to him, too. If you're watching from ice side kind of and rink side, he's tall as anything. I mean, 6'6" is pretty intimidating to look at. And sometimes it looks like he's even bigger than that, quite honestly. But so he's a presence and a really good shot, too. I did like that about him. He's definitely got the scoring presence. And to touch on what you guys said about Rupstov as well, getting a first look at him was going to be something to watch, especially in Nolan Patrick's absence. We tend to forget that Rupstov wasn't at camp last year because of his situation in Russia. So to see him for the first time and after a year after his draft year made a big difference, I think. He looked way more polished than you would expect. He looked like he has all the all-around skills. I thought he really knew where to be at all times. He knows where to go. He's got really good smarts, it looks like. And then to touch on your points, he's a great skater and he's got a great shot. So there's a lot to like about him. I'm going to bring up a few other guys too. just to add into it a little bit, Noah Cates I really liked because of the fact that he, again, fairly unknown going into the draft. He had some rising stock as the draft hit, but as a high schooler, you don't really think too much about players like that. You don't hear a whole lot about them. But I liked the skill set, and I like quite a bit about his game and just some of the things he could bring. And it's early. It's very soon to tell, but you like his presence. I thought Connor Bunneman looked really good. You saw a lot of what made him a good player last year in juniors, this year at camp, as opposed to last year. A couple players from last year's draft that I thought were 10 times more comfortable at this year's camp were Pascal Laberge and Wade Allison. Those two, I particularly Wade Allison, because I thought last year at camp he had this deer in the headlights look about him that just made it seem like this was pretty extraordinary. This was something big for him being a recent draft pick. And this year, total opposite. This is calm, cool, and collected, very involved, very energetic, almost mentoring new kids that were there. It's very good to see. And then I'm going to touch on the one player he isn't a Flyers draft pick, but he was at camp as an invite. It's Ivan Kozarenkov. I mean, this Russian player who, for whatever reason, wasn't drafted, because he should have been, really, after watching his skill set. This kid turned heads. I mean, he really turned heads, and it would not be shocking at all if he doesn't end up with a contract, because I kind of compare him to what Phil Myers was, when the Flyers got a look at Myers and realized, we may have a steal as an undrafted player here. We better not let him go back into the pool. I think the Flyers may feel the same way about Kozarenkov. I mean, it seems like he's the total package as an offensive player, and the number of Russian prospects the Flyers already have and the way they work together. I was watching a couple 2-on-1 drills on Sunday, and Mikhail Vorobyev and Radel Fizleyev were showing such great chemistry, and it's like, that seems obvious. They're both Russian players. They've probably played with each other at some point in time or practiced with each other or something over the course of their progression, and you're looking at it and you're going, well, of course they seem to work well together. It just seems obvious. So it's not a strange thing for the Flyers to have Russian prospects anymore, especially given the success that Provorov has had at the NHL level already, even in his rookie year. The fact that Rubtsov is making a very quick climb, I would say. I did not expect to see Rubtsov the way that he was this past weekend.
Kozarenkov, just to your point, during the 3-on-3, he had an NHL-type wrist shot that beat Felix Sandstrom. Like, he beat Felix Sandstrom dead to right, top of the blocker, just right below the crossbar. You could hear the ping all the way in the press box. So, absolutely, Kevin, that kid deserves a contract right off the bat.
Yeah, and again, trying to go back to the Russian prospect thing, I remember at a time we were talking about this and going, the Flyers aren't going to draft a guy like Ivan Provorov because they stay away from the Russian prospects or whatever, That's quite a myth at this point in time, given the fact that, like we said, Provorov's had his success. I did not expect to see Rubtsov the way that he was at camp, given the fact that he really didn't play much in North America. He had, 16 games to his name, I think, last year in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, and that's it. Then he had to have hand surgery, too. So to look at the way that he played and the type of shot that he has, he was off of hand surgery at the end of the season. It held him out at the end of the year, and he looks great. So, I kind of would have thought with Rubtsov that you were looking at a player who was definitely not 1 year away. I would have given him 2 to 3 just to get into an NHL lineup. I'm kind of not thinking that anymore. I mean, the way that they've opened up spots for some of these kids and are trying to do it even this year, yeah, Rubtsov's not going to make the team this year. He doesn't have enough experience at the North American game to be able to fit right in and be an NHL player. But give him 1 year, maybe 2. I could see him competing for a spot next year, quite honestly. I mean, it's not a stretch to say that. It just depends on how the spots open up.
I believe that's the expectation, however, with Valtteri Filppula's contract being just 1 more year at $5 million, that he was supposed to be the stopgap in between Mikhail Vorobyev, who we've yet to get into, and I'd like to know your guys' take on his play, and Rubtsov. Look, those were the two guys that are supposed to go in and sort of take Filppula's spot for the next after this season. Excuse me.
Yeah, and I'll throw another name out there, not prospect-wise, but another name that could open up a spot is Matt Reed's contract is up after next year too. There's another forward slot. So you're seeing all these slots open up. You're right. You're going to have to eventually do that. I think Vorobiev as a physical presence is something to keep an eye on. I want to see him play at the AHL level before I really fully evaluate. We pretty much know that that's where he's going to be. He's not one of the forwards that people are talking about from making a push for the roster spot. We haven't even gotten into Oscar Lindblom, who is obviously one of the forwards that was worth watching, especially with Nolan Patrick not there. But at the same time, I was very impressed with Vorobiev in the World Junior Championships, and then to watch him bring that to this camp. And again, this is another guy who, at the time, he wasn't under an entry-level deal yet. So he comes over. This is really your first exposure to him at a camp. And the skills look polished because he's had so much time since his draft year. So I think that that's a way to look at things too. That he's had some time. It's quality time to work on some things. He's going to definitely probably get a quality year in the AHL with the Phantoms. So why not see what he's got after 1 year? And he potentially fits into this picture after another season as well. I mean, there's so many players. That's kind of the thing. It's a good problem for Ron Hextall to have. There are so many players. You could write out a list of players who you thought did something impressive or a series of things impressive at this camp, and you'd end up with half of the players that were at the camp. There were 40 players at camp. You could say something positive and actually dive into their potential future with this team on 20 of them. It's amazing.
When I was looking at the 3-on-3, it was really hard to evaluate some of these guys just because it was so chaotic. You had, pretty much 2 mini hockey games going on. And so looking at Oscar Lindblom, it was funny because that guy had probably the most confidence out of anybody on the ice. You could just see him trying to make so many different plays. And one of them he got beat on, and it was like a turnover that went straight into a goal. I believe it was Warren, but I'm not sure on that. But you can see that guy can make the plays. You can see he can go out there and just kind of take over, just like how I alluded to with Rubstov and Myers, how they can control the play. And that was the impressive thing with Oscar Lindblom. And talking to him after the 3-on-3 tournament, you could just tell that he's focused on being a flyer and not so much any of the little things that a young player might be worried about.
Yeah, and I thought he had a confident look about him as well. Just the way that he carries himself, he's definitely, as he looks like he's been there before, which obviously he has. One thing that I've always liked about Lindblom is the fact that he looks like he's the one player out there who is having the most fun of anybody. During drills even, always a smile on his face. He looked more like a mentor at this particular camp. I saw a little part of him on Sunday, and he's talking to Isaac Ratcliffe, and he's kind of nothing serious, nothing crazy, but just kind of in conversation with him, smiling the whole way again. So things like that, and I feel like he's going to have the potential to compete for a spot. We all know that. But more than that, I think his confidence level is a big reason why he really has a shot to make this team. And not only make the team, but be a positive impact on the team right away, too. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I also want to touch on the fact that when the news came out about Nolan Patrick and him not being a part of the on-ice portion of camp, that kind of triggered a reaction among Flyers fans. This is kind of like that here we go again, why can't we have nice things kind of thing. And you look at his situation, I don't really know what there is to be concerned about when Ron Hextall and company did their homework before the draft and still took him. I mean, if this was such a problem, wouldn't you not take the guy?
That's just the law of Philadelphia sports, Kev. Any shiny new prospect has to get hurt at some point during his developmental stages, whether it be Markelle Fultz or Carson Wentz or just about anybody who the 76ers have taken in the past 4 years. They have to be hurt at some point. So why would the Flyers be immune to that?
Well, that's true, but I mean, I just don't get why it's a problem. If this was going to happen, and it was no secret that he played through a misdiagnosed sports hernia, he gets it repaired. He gets it repaired on his own so he can save part of his summer, things like that. My thought on it is why does that all of a sudden derail what he's going to have the potential to do when September rolls around? I don't see it. I look at a guy who, by doing this, gets the chance to heal up a little bit. It's not ideal. It's not a perfect world. And Ron Hextall said this. It's not perfect, but at least it gives him a chance. You never know what they're going to do. I look at it as if he comes back in September, recovered, with a chance to go out there to be his full self, or as full of his self as he can be, fully healthy, or close to, then at least I think that still gives him a shot to make the team. I don't see why not. If he's got the potential, if he played the way he did last year and played that way last year with this injury, then why would taking away the injury and dealing with a slight portion of the recovery change anything about his potential to make an NHL roster? I just don't see that.
Yeah, there's no problem with this. It's just the Chicken Little syndrome some Flyers fans have, where the sky's falling every time like the slightest bit of bad news is. What's the worst thing that happened? He missed development camp. Development camp is just to evaluate talent, just to see where they're at in their game. Nobody in development camp is going to, not everybody in development camp is going to completely wow you and make the team. It's just to check out where these kids are at. And with Nolan Patrick, you could pretty much see where this kid is at. He's, as we said on the last podcast, he's probably going to not go back to junior because even Bob McKenzie thinks there's nothing left for him to learn there. So you can see what he has in training camp. So any kind of inclination that this is, the sky is falling, that this is terrible, it's just an overreaction by a fan base that just loves to pout.
Yeah, and I agree, Dan, because of the fact that that's kind of where I was going with this, is he's going to have training camp to figure this out and to show what he's got. And better for him to rest now, to recover now, get back from this injury, and let's see what he's got when September rolls around. If it's anywhere near what he was as a player last year while dealing with the injury, or better yet, what he was 2 years ago when he was fully healthy, look out. I mean, that's what's supposed to be touted about him, and he's getting this taken care of, and he knows the situation. I agree with Ron Hextall that it's pretty noble of him at his age to sit there and say, I'm getting this done on my own, and I will get it done even 10 days before the draft to make sure I have a chance to recover and be back in time for training camp with enough time over the summer to still work on a few things. It says a lot about an 18-year-old kid. And I guess one other thing I think we want to throw out there in terms of forwards while we're on the subject of forwards, and it's not anything that relates to a prospect, well, really anymore. At one point in time, this player was a prospect as a first-round pick formerly. But Scott Laughton re-signed for 2 years earlier this week, and we just wanted to touch on that, given the fact that it's one piece of news that came out regarding the restricted free agents that the Flyers had left to sign. They still have 4 more to go. It's both goalies, Anthony Stolarz, Alex Lyon, and then Taylor Lear and Cole Bardreau are also still awaiting new contracts. And you look at that, the Laughton deal had to happen, not just because he's a restricted free agent and they all likely happen one way or another, but you protected him from the expansion draft, so you're basically saying he's worth a roster spot on paper. It was a move that you wanted to use to protect him so you didn't lose him for nothing. Now you're also trying to give him a chance to show what he has. It's a very reasonable deal for a player who needs to kind of prove himself a little bit. 109 games really isn't enough time, over the course of 3 seasons, mind you, is really not enough time to see what he's got with a full slate. He obviously looked fine at the AHL level last year, but to give him a chance, I think it does kind of put the writing on the wall a little bit for a player like Mike Vecchione, who had re-signed prior to free agency. And it just kind of says he may be more or less AHL bound, and then Laughton may be in the running for that spot. I mean, they're going to compete for a spot. That's the point of training camp. But I think Laughton's got the upper hand on this, especially given the way the contract is structured. It just seems to me like a deal that says, come out and you've got 2 years with us to try to prove yourself in some way, to try to have that career year that makes us realize what your full potential was as a first-rounder. I'm fine with it. I mean, it's tough to see exactly where he's going to fit in at the moment. That picture will have way more clarity on it once we get to September. But for now, it's a move that had to be made because it's very expected. He should be in the running for a roster spot come September, for sure.
When you think about it, I mean, Hextall still had absolutely nothing to do with the organization at the time that Lawton was taken. He was still with Los Angeles. So, you would think that Hextall would completely want to, clean house as far as prospects were concerned and some of the younger guys were concerned. But not that there's really much reason for him to do that anyway. But, now he's going to hang on to Lawton. And, we've heard in the past few weeks since the expansion draft that Hextall's still pretty sold on him. So he's, almost seems like he's getting this edge kind of going into training camp. So obviously he and Vecchione are going to battle that out, and we'll see how that one goes. But, the Flyers, they've said that they're sold on Lawton, and, this 2-year deal, it's more or less, I look at it as a bridge deal, just to see what else he can prove over that span, and, just see what else he can do.
It's funny that you say that it's you think it's a bridge deal, Rob, because I was considering that it was something of a last chance, because I know that they're saying that they bought in on the kid, but I don't see it, because the one kind of full season that he had, he didn't have a really good season. He was used in a third, fourth line center role, and eventually he was usurped by Nick Cousins. And if he doesn't play to the expectation, and I don't think he should be a center, I think he should probably play left wing with Sean Couturier. It's just to, get the two-way play down pat. But if he doesn't play up to expectations, he's gone. He's not going to get another deal after this. So yeah, it is a bridge deal in that regard, but he's only got 2 seasons to prove to this organization that he's a part of the future, because there's a wave of young kids that we just saw during development camp that are coming for that spot that he's going to try and take.
If that really, Dan, I mean, he might only have 1 year, could be even less than that, just depending on how ready these kids are too. I mean, you look at what Lawton would have to do just to make the team this year, and we're talking about him being on the bubble for a spot, having to go into a roster battle with Vecchione, and then what happens if he doesn't pan out after that? Do you reverse the situation? Do you go flip-flop the two? Vecchione comes up, Lawton goes back down to the Phantoms, and that's where he ends up kind of riding out the duration of the year if everything starts working the right way. It could happen to anybody at any time, and I don't think there's a fear to do that again but from Ron Hextall. I think he's going to be willing to put Lawton wherever he sees fit, if it's with the Flyers, which I think is the expectation, but it's not necessarily it's not a necessity for Hextall. He doesn't have to keep him up with the Flyers if that's not what's working. I fully expect them to allow Lawton the chance to start the year with the Flyers, but again, he's got 1 season to really get it figured out, because whether he stays up for the full year or not, from 1 season to the next, we'll be sitting here again during another offseason and looking ahead to prospects. And if there's another prospect, we just talked about what happens if Rubtsov or Vorobyev are ready. What if they're ready after 1 year in the AHL for like Vorobyev's going to have? Or what if the year of juniors, full juniors, that Rubtsov's going to get next year, what if that makes them ready? And suddenly there's another roster spot that's gone. And you have to start looking at who's expendable, who is definitely going to have to give up their spot. And Lawton's in one of those positions. Yeah, there's going to be guys who aren't re-signed. You look at this season and you go, if we're looking for an idea of where an Oscar Lindblom or a Nolan Patrick is going to fit into this roster, then you look at the Braden Shen trade, or you look at Belmar going to Vegas, or you look at the Flyers not re-signing Chris Vandevelde, and you go, there's some open roster spots. There's some players who were on this roster all year last year who are no longer here. Now we have an idea of where those players may fit in. The same thing's going to happen if you consider, maybe, if Filppula doesn't get re-signed. If Matt Reed's, it's more than likely that when Matt Reed's contract is up, he's gone. And you start to see these spots open up. But what happens if somebody like Lawton just isn't cutting it at that level, and there's players that are better than him regardless? And it's, instead of just saying, hey, we can plug this spot with Lawton and then still bring another kid in, it could become a situation where Lawton's the odd man out of the group and has to take a back seat. So it could go a bunch of different ways. But for now, I think Lawton's part of the picture, but that obviously can change very quickly.
And it's interesting too, Kevin, just because he isn't waiver exempt. He has to go through waivers if he doesn't make the team. So how do you do that if you're Ron Hextall? Do you risk this kid that you protected above, the likes of Belmar and Matt Reed and Dale Weiss and all them, and then you don't think he's capable of playing on the team to start the season? So do you risk losing him for nothing because you tried to protect him from that? And then if he doesn't play well this season, what kind of trade value is he going to have? First round pick or not?
Well, yeah, and that's kind of why I agree with what you're saying, Dan, because that's where I come from with the starting the season out with the Flyers, kind of, because at that point in time, yeah, you don't have to put him through waivers. He makes the team. It all makes some sense. And then you kind of go from there, because the only thing that would be hurt by him not playing well enough to have to send him to the minor leagues at that point in time would be the fact that his trade value wouldn't be much of anything if you could find somebody in the minors better than Lawton to come up and essentially take his spot. At that point in time, to me, there's absolutely no fear if he's not living up to the potential or the expectations that they may have for him. There's no fear in putting him on waivers, because unless it's a team that's desperate for help, I don't think he would be lost for nothing through waivers. I think that he would end up back on the Phantoms, and then you would have to kind of go from there. And then who knows? I mean, it's an interesting situation, because if Nick Cousins could get traded for even some minimal value, then Scott Lawton can be too. But that really depends on how he plays, and that value will depend a lot on that, obviously.
I just took a jab at Flyers fans for enjoying pouting, but they'll definitely have something to pout about if Scott Lawton doesn't, play up to expectations, reach that point of development that he needs to reach to be a Flyer 24/7. Because the Flyers, and I'm sorry to repeat this, but the Flyers passed up on Ole Mata to pick Scott Lawton, so that's something they'll probably keep talking about over and over for another 10 years after this kid is either succeeds or doesn't succeed. But that's that's the draft.
And it's the same thing with looking at a player like, the Flyers picked Kevin Marshall, and 2 picks later, PK Subban goes. You look at that and you go, Marshall's not even in the NHL anymore. I think his hockey career is completely over, quite honestly. And Subban was in the Stanley Cup final last year.
Still not as bad as the Flyers took Mike Ritchie because they didn't want to take any European players. And then 1 pick later, there goes Jaromir Jagr.
Yeah, for real. And then not only that, but they packaged Ritchie in the deal with Forsberg to get Lindros. So, not that Eric Lindros was a bad player. I mean, he's a Hall of Famer, but so is Peter Forsberg, and Peter Forsberg's got 2 things that Eric Lindros doesn't have, and that's 2 Stanley Cup rings.
He also had Joe Sakic, too. Lindros never had Joe Sakic.
That's true. and they also had the goalie. Let's not forget that either.
But that's an important caveat. Sorry to derail this conversation to make it about the Eric Lindros trade. But
it's always about the Eric Lindros.
We've talked about Eric Lindros on this more than we have some of the other players.
We could have a whole 3-hour podcast dedicated to this.
We can. And maybe we will do that later on this offseason as we look for things to talk about when there's not much going on as August hits. So that's a good one. I like that idea. But let's try to get back on track and shift some gears here, because the Flyers really put a lot of attention into adding forwards to the pipeline in the past few draft years, and there are plenty of them for sure, and especially a few that stood out, as we mentioned. So now that we've reviewed the forwards, we're going to shift gears and look at the defensemen next, so stay with us here on the Flyerdelphia Podcast.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
With the look at the forwards complete, we turn our attention now to the blue line. And the Flyers in recent years have stocked up on defensive prospects, and with spots available on the roster as soon as this upcoming season, it's obvious we're going to start looking at the ones closer to making the NHL roster and putting an even closer look on those players. But there's also others in the system that aren't on the forefront that are also worth mentioning. So who on the blue line was most impressive to you at this camp?
I think the obvious answer is Travis Sanheim.
That's the obvious, but...
That's the obvious choice. That's the low-hanging fruit. You could tell that his experience in the American leagues really paid dividends. I mean, he looked like he was on another level out there. It looked like there was these defensive prospects, and then there was just Travis Sanheim. I mean, it was unreal.
I'm going to go kind of out on a limb with this one here, so to speak, because for most of the offseason, especially given the way that everything was at the end of last season, Sam Moran makes his NHL debut, Robert Hagg makes his NHL debut, and you started to see Ron Hextall give these kids a chance, even if it was just for one game at the end of the year. And we kind of assumed that when Nick Schultz and Michael Del Zotto were not going to be brought back, and 2 defensive spots opened up, that it kind of was kind of assumed that it's going to be Moran and Hagg. That's the 2 that would seem most logical to fill the void. I'm starting to think that Travis Sanheim factors into this roster picture way more than we anticipated. And it's not that much of a stretch. He certainly was probably the first candidate to be called up in a situation where long-term injury kind of came into play. If somebody was going to be out long-term defensively, a la Mark Streit, Shane Gostisbehere, then I think Sanheim would have been the first guy to mind. But he's got a legitimate shot to make the team out of camp, I think. I mean, as polished a skater as you're going to find, I think. He was called Provorov-esque. I mean, and that wasn't a stretch. He really is that smooth of a skater. I think that one of the things that I've seen from him over the course of several camps that he's been at now is he just keeps getting bigger. I think he
really
keeps adding
does.
muscle, and he looks like he's way more of a physical presence, which is something that all defensemen have to be in some capacity. If you want to be good defensively, we're going to look at his mobility, the fact that he can contribute offensively, and those are all great things, but it only goes so far if you're not helping to keep the puck out of your net. And I can see Sanheim being a player who has the ability to do just as much in the defensive zone as he does in the offensive zone. He very much has the potential. I mean, it's hard to play comparisons here because Provorov has such good offensive-minded skills while being better defensively, I think. He's a better defensive defenseman, but he has the offensive capabilities, and that's important. We couldn't say that about Gostisbehere because of the fact that he was such an offensive skilled player that you kind of saw the struggle that was defensively. And he tried to focus on that a little bit more last year, and he got better at some things, and it's obviously a process, but you're trying to bridge the gap between Ivan Provorov, good all-around defenseman, number 1 defenseman quality, and then where do the rest kind of fit in? It's tough to do while they're prospects, but Sanheim really has those all-around abilities, and that's why he's got potential to jump right into this roster as soon as this upcoming season. I think training camp, he's definitely one to watch.
I'll tell you one thing about Sanheim is I was never really sold on the kid since they took him in 2014. I thought he's too small, he's too one-dimensional. There's just it just wasn't going to be a good enough player. I considered him almost expendable, and slowly but surely he's really starting to prove me wrong. He really, like you said, Kevin, he really bulked up coming into this year's training camp, and he was just on another level. I mean, it was like watching 2 completely different kind of camps going on. There was everybody else, and then there was Travis Sanheim.
One of the weirdest games that I saw at the 3-on-3 tournament was the Black versus Gray game, and Black was just hammering Gray. I think it was Morgan Frost put them up either 4-1 or 4-0, and Gray didn't look like they were, gonna come back or gonna do much. And then all of a sudden, I was jotting down, I was taking some notes down. And then all of a sudden, Travis Sanheim just shot off a howitzer, got him on the board. Then a couple seconds later, I'm still writing things down. Travis Sanheim scored again, and then they wound up coming back to tie that game. This is the type of aspect that Travis Sanheim, and you touched upon it, Kevin, that he's a very dynamic offensive defenseman, and if he can do that, at an AHL level, which he did last year, who's to say he can't do that next year in the NHL? My one thing with him trying to compete for the Flyers spot in place of Sam Moran or Robert Hagg. Could you imagine being one of those players, especially Sam Moran, who's just, he was drafted in the first round. He's gone through he went through all those development camps. He's played a couple years in Lehigh Valley, and there was that scare a couple years ago where he was like, oh, he's going to make the Flyers. All Holmgren has to do is trade Luke Shen and Nick Grossman. It didn't happen, so he had to go back down. I think it was to juniors then. Can you imagine being that kid and just be like, nope, Travis Sanheim makes it. You got to go back to Lehigh Valley, Sam.
Yeah,
Like that kid's going to take out so much of his frustration on more faces of the players at the AHL level if he doesn't make the team this year.
I'll tell you one thing for the record. I don't want to be the one that tells Big Sam he's not making the team.
I don't think anybody wants to tell a 6'7" giant, hey, you're not on the team. I mean, if there's any man for the job, I guess it's Ron Hextall, who knew how to bring it himself. But,
But in terms of defensemen that we haven't touched on, I did touch on him before. His play during the 2-on-2 double overtime. Phil Myers looked dominant in the 2-on-2 overtime. Like, he's just completely dictated the pace. He dictated the play. Anything he wanted to do during that 2-on-2, he did. Like, Team Black didn't lose that game because of Phil Myers. They lost that game because the forwards he was passing to just couldn't finish. He made this lightning quick pass to Matthew Strome, and Matthew Strome was in a little tight, and plus Matthew Strome, he's got to work on his skating, and he couldn't finish. And then an overtime later, Linus Hogberg finishes off the double overtime. But Phil Myers, that's kind of when I got sold on him, because he wasn't as dominant. He wasn't as good as like what you guys are saying about Travis Sanheim, because Sanheim was being compared to Provorov, as you said, Kevin. But Phil Myers, really, there was an expectation that you had for the kid just because he played so well in juniors, and everybody keeps, talking about him so fondly. And then you see him in action, and you're just like, no, this kid definitely has a chance of making the Flyers this year too.
I think the thing with Myers, and you guys can feel free to agree or disagree with this, but I think with Myers, there's a level that there's a way that fans look at Myers and Sanheim, and it's first rounder versus undrafted. It's Travis Sanheim was the first round pick. There's an expectation to be that good. And then Myers is this stunning prospect because he was undrafted, and you're going, how did we get him? That's the way fans react. How did we get such a prospect as an undrafted free agent? It's the way that we're reacting, like we said with Kozarenkov. It's an undrafted free agent instantly with any potential is a surprise right there. I mean, I think that's why Oscar Lindblom gets the buzz that he gets. It's a 5th round pick. There's not as high expectations. So Sanheim has high expectations as a 1st round pick. And as great as it is to see his development, you sit there and you almost sit there and go, he was picked in 2014. It's 2017. It's almost a sense of, it's about time we start to see him on the verge, because it's been 3 years. He's played 3 more seasons. And now I don't view it that way at all, because defensemen take a good amount of time to develop. And as Rob mentioned, you could see that he needed to grow as much as anything. He's done that. He's put it in at a pro level now. I remember going to a game at PPL Center last year and seeing him skate then and realizing, okay, there's something to this. This kid's got it, because he can skate with the best of them at the AHL level. So it's going to start to translate over to the NHL level soon enough. I'd really like to see him get a good long look in camp. I'd like to see Myers get the same thing, and Myers did last year. The thing about Myers to me, and it's almost unfair, because you sit there and you go, Sanheim's the more polished player at the moment, and that's what gives him an edge. But otherwise, what's wrong with Myers? There's nothing wrong with him. He's got the same skating ability and the potential in the skating. He's got the offensive prowess. He's got the defensive ability and capability. This is another all-around defensive prospect. You're talking about it, and this is why I liked what I saw from Sanheim even more, because Sanheim came in with that more one-dimensional aspect to his game when he was drafted, and he doesn't look like that anymore. He looks like he has more of an all-around game. So you're telling me that in a matter of a couple of years, the Flyers could have a blue line that has Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, and Phil Myers, and all three of them are quality all-around defensemen that can play in all situations? Where do I sign up? That's the thing. It's so foreign to this fan base to have so many quality defensemen, and that's what you have in this group of youthful defensemen who are all closing in on big things.
And it'll be very important, too, because what the nature of the game now is to have at least two pairings of defensemen who can push the puck up ice quickly. We saw that with Pittsburgh. We saw that with Nashville. And just get the puck up ice, and so the forwards can start generating offense, and the defensemen can also like jump in and join the play and do what they do. And so with the Flyers, at that point, you'd have Provorov, you'd have Sanheim, you have Myers, and you have Gostisbehere. So you'd have that almost right away. And that's not even including, Gudas is actually pretty good at keeping the puck in the zone as well. And then you have Moran, who has a shot that could probably take your torso off. So that the defense in the future is looking good. You hope there's no kind of, obstacles in the way, somebody doesn't regress, all that stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, it almost seems unfair to some of the other defensemen at camp, because you look at down the list, Hogberg had a good camp. I didn't see anything wrong with him. It's just you sit there and you go, look at the competition. Look at the guys you have to compete with. And it's not just the ones who are at camp at this point anymore, because Gostisbehere has gone on and graduated by playing now 2 seasons in the NHL. Provorov has graduated by playing a full season in the NHL. Sam Moran and Robert Hagg have graduated from the development camps because they've been professionals for long enough. They've been playing professionally for several seasons now. So there's so many, and we talk about those 4, and then we throw in 2 more who look like they're at least on the outside of being NHLers already, and there is obviously still some NHL veterans who are part of the current group, Gudas being one, and Andrew McDonald still being around as another. And you look at that grouping, and you go, and I'm not even throwing in the 2 veterans, I'm throwing Gudas and McDonald in this picture. I'm talking just go Sanheim, Myers, and then do the other 4 that weren't at camp, Gostisbehere, Moran, Hagg, and Provorov. And you look at those 6, and you instantly start to picture a defensive group like that, and it doesn't even factor in that Hogberg has potential, and Mark Friedman has potential, and David Bernhard has potential. So there's all of these other players that do factor in, but those 6 highlight the group by far, and it's great to see that Gostisbehere was the one who broke the wall down, kind of, when it came to prospects making the jump, and then Provorov did it along with Travis Konechny and made some noise that way in making the jump to the NHL, and you're going to see more of it in the coming years. To factor these other 2 into it, it almost brings the defensive discussion from this camp down to 2 players. It really does.
I'll tell you one thing. I was keeping not necessarily a close eye, but I was watching out for Terrence Amorosa and David Drake, and I'll tell you one thing. Don't get too used to those guys. I hope you're not too attached to them, because it's been 4 development camps for these guys now. They were both taken in 2013, and just nothing from them.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, because David Drake, to me, does a lot of good things at camp, but camp is camp. You're working on some of your skills, you're trying to improve, and at the same time, it's practice drills. That's basically what it is. Otherwise, you never hear about these guys. You're right. You never hear anything about them. So, the only other prospect defensively that I can think of that was truly worth mentioning out of this entire grouping was Wyatt Kalynuk, because, as a draft pick from this season, you just wanted to see what he had, and it was obvious. He did a couple of those 2-on-1 drills too on Sunday and looked a little out of place, out of position, definitely has some things to work on, but he's a recent draft pick. He's going to have to work on those things.
When you take into consideration, he's a 7th-round pick in what's widely panned as a weak draft, so he's got some stuff to work on, but everything is just, it's like I said, I wasn't completely sold on Travis Sanheim, and obviously there's a big disparity between both players. I can't really make a comparison here, but, he's somebody who could prove us wrong too.
Well, sure. And the thing about it is that at the same time, you can sit there and go, he could prove us wrong and be something like Sanheim, or he could turn out to be what Jesper Pettersson was, And same round, you have hopes for the guy, but sometimes these just don't pan out. So we'll see where it goes, kind of.
Yeah, a lot of these guys, too, are late-round picks, with the exception of Mark Friedman, who's a third-round pick, and his development is now because he's likely going to be a part of the Lehigh Valley Phantoms going into next season. But a lot of these guys, they're projects. They're 7th, 5th-round picks. So yeah, with David Drake and Amorosa, you'd like to see a little bit more progression, but David Drake plays for UConn. UConn isn't exactly a hockey powerhouse, so if you can get a guy that comes out of a program like that is like a great player, then that's kind of rare.
All right, so we've looked at the forwards, we've looked at the defensemen. That leaves one position left. We'll check in on the goalies next. Stay with us on the Flyerdelphia Podcast.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
So the Flyers also have plenty of goaltenders in the system as well, and 4 of them were on hand at camp, including 2 that seem to stand out above the rest. So knowing what we know about the Flyers' goaltending pipeline, what stood out about this group at camp?
The goalies at camp this year, I was trying to keep a pretty close eye on, and I didn't see as much as I would have liked to have seen, some good stuff out of Maciej Tomek. I had an eye on him, and it looked like he could have used a lot of work on his glove hand. I saw him getting picked, shot after shot to the glove side. I think that's something he could have definitely used a little bit of work on, but obviously he's still a young guy. He's still developing, and we all know how long it takes goalies to develop. So even if goalies here at development camp, even if they're not going to, burn the world down, even if they're not going to completely impress you, they're still working on it, they're still developing, and, we'll see how they progress.
The thing about Tomek, too, Rob, is that poor kid hasn't been able to play.
Yeah.
He went to North Dakota, he got hurt, then Cam Johnson came out of nowhere and took that job over, and Tomek hasn't been able to play ever since. His development has gone, I don't want to say awry, but now he's got to go back to USHL. And one last note on him, he was a part of one of the weirdest plays at the 3-on-3 tournament. Essentially, that game I alluded to, the black versus gray tied it up thanks to Travis Sanheim and a bunch of the other guys. Well, they had to tie it up by pulling Tomek. So Tomek goes to the bench, they get the extra attacker, they score, they tie it up. Well, Tomek's got to get back to the net. And and this is a continuous thing. There's no stoppages. There's no nothing. So the puck is going right back into play. Tomek's got to skate. He's got to get right back onto the ice and get to the net. And he was not even on the ice by the time that Noah Cates had the puck. It just shot into the empty net. And that's how Team Black won. And that type of urgency is like, you could see as Tomek went, like he got back into the net and he just looked over to the bench and you can see one of the Flyers trainers just throw his hands up like, what are you doing? So if you're not going to show the urgency out there on in a development camp situation, I don't know, man. You gotta show these guys something. Otherwise, you're going to be in the USHL for a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, Tomek to me seemed like a predictable draft pick given the North Dakota connection. Was at the same time that Hackstall was coming into the team, so it just seemed kind of predictable. He hasn't stood out to me at all. I mean, it's the lack of playing time, obviously, but at the same time, at camp, he looks miles behind the rest of them. It really is kind of the Carter Hart, Felix Sandstrom show when it comes to that type of thing. And, there was an obvious emphasis on that, given that Anthony Stolars and Alex Lyon aren't part of these camps anymore. And I guess we can assume that had he still been part of the team when this rolled around, Merrick Madsen probably would have been in attendance again as well. But obviously, he's since had his rights traded. As part of the Nick Cousins trade with Arizona. So you look at those two, and then it's kind of like what we said with the defensemen. It was for the defensemen at this camp, it was Travis Sanheim, Phil Myers, then everybody else. For these goalies, it was Carter Hart, Felix Sandstrom, and the others. And it's hard to pick one over the other right now. I mean, it's tough to do at camp anyway because they're both, during drills, you can't really get a good read on goaltenders because you're really trying to watch the players from my understanding, during the 3-on-3, both Sandstrom and Hart looked really good. Is that the case, Dan?
I thought Felix Sandstrom stood out apart from even Carter Hart. Hart let in a couple goals. It's 3-on-3. It's really hard for goaltenders. It's really hard to assess goaltenders in that situation. But Felix Sandstrom was incredible post to post. Like, he was making some saves where I'm like, wait, he stopped that? So in terms of like evaluating these guys based on something that you really probably shouldn't be evaluating these guys on, Sandstrom won the day. But I was really surprised. I know we're having a Sandstrom versus Carter Hart debate, but I was really impressed by the way Darian Hansen played.
Yeah, I was going to bring him up too.
On the day that's supposed to be about Sandstrom and Hart, and when I looked at the roster, when I took the picture, put it on Twitter, all that, when I looked at this roster, and I'm like, oh, okay, so that team's not going to win. Because, like, who is this kid? And then he wound up playing great. He made a ton of saves in that 2-on-2 overtime. Like, are they challenging? Yeah, because it's a 2-on-2 overtime. Was he as impressive as Felix Sandstrom? No, but he's definitely a kid you look at and you're like, all right, well, the Flyers just traded Merrick Madsen. All right, well, maybe this kid can just take Merrick Madsen's place, and I think he's just a commit for Union, so you get a little bit more time with the kid going to college.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. He is a Union commit, and he certainly stood out, and I think he's another one who has a candidate, because it's an invite, he's a candidate to possibly get out of there with a contract as well. I mean, it does circle back to Hart and Sandstrom. We don't even really bring Stolarz and Lyon into the picture at all because they weren't at the camp, but at the same time, we've had this discussion before, and we looked at it around free agency as well when it was Brian Elliott being signed, and you have Brian Elliott and Michael Neufert being the goalies that the Flyers are probably going to go forward with this season and next possibly, and then you're waiting on it seems like you're waiting on one of these two. You're waiting on either Carter Hart or Felix Sandstrom, or both, potentially. But then again, it's very hard to see one of these goalies finally reach the pinnacle, to reach the NHL, and then have to share the net. I don't think that's the goal. I don't think that Ron Hextall believes in the platoon system like that. I think he believes in it with goalies who don't typically play a lot. You know, you look at when you compare Brian Elliott and Michael Neufert and the number of starts they've made over the course of the last few years, you see a platoon system that works possibly because they don't get overworked. I don't see that with Carter Hart, and I don't see that with Felix Sandstrom either. I see two goalies that are going to want to be in this thing for the long haul. So you're waiting on one of them to take the lead. It's so hard to tell. Hart's younger than Sandstrom is. It's so hard to tell which one has the edge. I love Sandstrom's post-to-post ability. I think his lateral movement is so on point. It's outstanding. And Hart's gotten all-around kind of set to him that just needs fine-tuning because he's still a kid. He's still a teenager. So, and again, we've talked about how long it takes the goalies to develop. So I don't have any problem waiting them out a little longer. I love the fact that we can even sit here and talk about these two and their potential and get excited about it because, you know, the Brian Elliott signing, while it was kind of necessary, while it fit what they were looking for, it was not something super exciting. It didn't scream it was the right move, but it wasn't an overly embraced move because to sit there and say we're going to platoon for another year or two, yeah, it's necessary because these goalies may not be ready. But at the same time, waiting is hard. It's very hard to wait out the process, especially when you haven't had a true number one goalie for so long. It's been so long. So, but from just looking at camp, those two did exactly what you would expect them to do, and they could, you know, the Flyers are in good hands with the fact they have two prospect goalies like that.
Something else to keep in mind with Hart and Sandstrom is not only did you just mention, Kev, that Hart is younger, but it's just that they're developing at completely different paces in completely different leagues. You know, you got Sandstrom, who is facing men night after night over in the Swedish league, and you have Hart, who's still, you know, working on his way in the WHL. He's still forging a path for himself there. So these are completely different leagues that gives them, completely different ways to develop.
You have to also remember who the Flyers GM right now is. It's Ron Hextall. What organization was Ron Hextall a part of before he went to the Flyers? The LA Kings. How did the LA Kings handle their goaltending situation? Because at one point, Jonathan Quick was not the surefire goaltender of that organization. It was Jonathan Bernier. So with the way that Ron Hextall is playing it, having these two kids go at it essentially for that spot is actually perfect. Because even if one kid doesn't quite make it to the level, you still have the guy that's Jonathan Quick in that situation.
That's true. And it's okay to let it develop the way that it is. Both of these kids had great years in their respective leagues last year. There's no reason to just try to create a competition right now. They're not competing for the same spot. They're going to probably be the lead goaltenders on each of their teams next year. So let that play out as it is. Why create a competition for them? I mean, it's cool to see in camp. I think that 3-on-3 tournament certainly had a Hart's team versus Sandstrom's team kind of vibe, just because you would have loved to have seen a match like that. And see, we have to go back to the World Junior Championships, too, in the semifinals, when it's Carter Hart and Team Canada playing Felix Sandstrom and Team Sweden. And those two goalies are going back and forth, toe-to-toe, making quality saves, difficult saves, and impressive saves, and making that such an entertaining game from a Flyers fan perspective, because you're watching two goalies that they have locked up, basically, that they have in their system, and you're going, this is amazing. Since when have we been able to sit here and talk about something like this? It's almost foreign. So to look at that, it's great to have. Yeah, there's a few good goalies in the system besides that. I mean, you don't even get to touch on Stolarz and Lyon and the fact that they're going to probably be splitting the starts with the Phantoms. Stolarz is the first option when, if something should happen to one of the goalies at the NHL level. Stolarz is going to be the first option when it comes to bringing somebody up. And then Lyon was more than capable at the AHL level last year. So it's a lot of positivity with that. And, at that point in time, take Tomek and put him to the back burner, kind of. It's rough. It's unfortunate because he certainly carried a lot of potential when he was drafted, but you have 1 year where the development just really isn't taking shape the way you expect. He wasn't getting any playing time. And next thing you know, he's out of the picture almost because there's just too many. It's like saying there's too many cooks in the kitchen, kind of. You've got Stolarz and Lyon at one level. You've got Hart and Sandstrom at a different part of their development. And really, having just those four is enough to talk about, let alone the fact that there are three other goalies in this organization's pipeline between Tomek, Ivan Fedotov, and now, you go Ustimenko as well, who was drafted this year. You look at all of those combined, where do you go after a while? I mean, that's why it starts narrowing in on the two that are with the Phantoms, the two that are in that developmental stage, and then the rest. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way we view it.
Well, it's also the two goaltenders that have the highest prestige would be Carter Hart and Felix Sandstrom. They're the ones that you look at even from draft day, like, all right, those are the guys. And for Anthony Stolarz, what was he, a third-round pick?
Stolarz was a
second-round pick. All right, so he comes in with that same prestige, but you haven't seen it as much as you'd like to in the AHL. I mean, you caught glimpses. He was very good in the beginning, and then he didn't play when he got called up, essentially. He got like 2 starts with the Flyers, and then Hextall just would not stop playing Steve Mason. So he had a little bit of a regression after that because he wasn't used to playing and he couldn't find his rhythm. It's really hard being a goaltender once you are out of your rhythm. You got to find your rhythm again, and sometimes you never do. And then you have Alex Lyon, who just came out of Yale, and that was a really good system to be a goaltender in. And then he came in here. He came to Lehigh Valley and just was great, pretty much great the whole season. So that's probably going to be a competition. Even like as you said, Kevin, like it's going to be Stolarz for as the first call up. It may not be. It could be Alex Lyon who just takes that over and becomes the first call up.
It could be, and at the same time, I view that situation the same way that you kind of compared the Sanheim Sam Moran situation. To me, if something happens to one of the two goalies at the NHL level, and Anthony Stolarz is not the first call, it feels like a slap in the face, because you've been the leader the whole way through, and it's understandable. Goalies can always surpass each other. It happens. It's it's the comparable position to being, a closer in baseball or a quarterback in football. You look at that and you go, how quickly can a goalie change his spot on a depth chart by being hurt, by poor performance? If something happens, you need to be ready to give the next one in line their chance. So if that's Alex Lyon, good for Alex Lyon and good for the Flyers for making possibly the right call there. I'm not going to deny that. But I look at Stolarz and I go, this is a guy who had to pay his dues big time, suffered a bad injury in juniors, made his way to the Phantoms, looked good for the Phantoms in his looked pretty good in his first year, got better in his second year, got his chance with the Flyers finally last season, played rarely but played well when he did get the chance, and I think I'd like to see him get a more fair shot at the NHL level when the time comes, just to really see what you have. Because to me, if you keep dragging him along like this, you're going to end up he'll be one of those players you lose for nothing in the future as well, because he'll go to a team that will give him the actual shot. So that's going to do it for this edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. On our next episode, we'll kind of do some off-season stuff. We're just going to get through the dog days of the off-season, the times when nothing's really happening. So we'll do some kind of fun stuff in the future shows just to bridge the gap up until training camp when things really start picking back up again. So thanks once again for listening. For Rob Riches and Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on sportstalkphilly.com.
This has been another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning, presented by sportstalkphilly.com.